Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. And it's a pleasure for me to be here for the first time, although I'm very often in Switzerland. And I enjoy this very much. In my talk, I will concentrate on criminal aggression and violence, not putting into the center of my talk normal aggression and violence, but of course we can discuss the links between both aspects of violence. So if he asks which types of individual violence or criminal violence exist, then we have to make at least distinguish between 3 to 4 types. The first type and most prominent types, maybe 80 or 90% of violent criminals is of the impulsive, reactive, aggressive type. And I will define this. A small number of those highly aggressive types and the most evil in our eyes are the psychopathic violence and antisocial behavior. Then there is another group which I do not expand on here, the instrumental violent people, which is a big question mark. And there's also a so-called acquired sociopathy or psychopathy. So it's quite difficult, but I will show you that these 3 types or 4 types are distinguished by different activity in their brains, also by their autonomic reactions, as we will see. So let's simply ask, what are the major factors when we study criminal violence? The most prominent factor is sex, the male. Most violent people are just men, as we'll see. Next is age. Third is genetic predispositions, so-called gene polymorphisms. Then, fourth, very big and maybe extremely important group are prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal anatomical and physiological brain damages, leading to brain damages and different brain development. And then low levels of serotonin, of a certain neuromodulator, is very prominent in and I will not discuss this anymore, high levels of testosterone. So we find a very distinct list of factors that dominate or cause criminal violence. The sex. In most countries, the majority of acts, as I have written here, of violence are committed by boys, adolescents, and young adults, predominantly of the age of between 14 and 20 years. And we can say the more dominant violence is, the more it's dominated by males. So low levels of criminal acts are done by both sexes, and if you get higher in violence, it's more and more dominated by males. And there's a very characteristic distinction between boys and men on the one hand and girls and women on the other hand. Boys and men are characterized by direct bodily violence, whereas women and girls are not less violent, but they have completely different types of violence, not criminal types. They have indirect violence. This is verbal aggression and relational violence. This is very practical because they don't end up in prison normally. But if they murder their husband, then this is very bad, because then they have to plan it. Whereas the male husband can just kill in rage the wife, and he could be condemned for manslaughter, but not for murder. But she, in order to kill her husband, has to commit murder. There's a big difference, and you should reflect on this. If you plan to kill your husband, you have to be very intelligent when you are a woman. So, as we'll see, there is a very, very clear difference between male and female brain, as we will see in a moment. Age. Most careers are violent start around the age of 11, and they are double around the age of 13 to 14, culminate 16, 7, and start to decrease after the age of 18. This is normal behavior. This is normal violence. So when we become 10 or 12, almost all males become aggressive and violent at school and competition and so on. This was and still is very normal, and when I went to school, this was absolutely normal when they were fighting to blood at school, and nobody was really protesting against it. Today it's different. So this appears that normal aggression at school would increase, but that's not the case. Just that's not tolerated anymore in this way as we grew up could. This is very normal. It rises during puberty and it decreases. This is not the problem. The problem are those who start very early, not at an age of 10 or 12, but at an age of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in the kindergarten. Very distinct early starters. And they continue until all their life. So those people here are very normal at an early age and normal, hopefully, at a later age. But when young boys start at 3 or 4 in the kindergarten, you can be sure by 60 or 70% they will become criminal violent if you don't treat them with a certain psychotherapy. This is, as you will see, a very clear predictor. Culture exploit this phenomenon, puberty violence phenomenon, because this can be increased much earlier in military societies, and military society dictatorships know that they have to start very early. So this starts even for normal population much earlier, and they make every effort not to let it decrease. This is a recipe for military society. They exploit a normal bell-shaped curve, and although people will remain normal, you can reshape this bell curve. This is one very important insight. But the hardcore are not those young military educated, then are the 5% that start very early and they persist. And this is the group of antisocial behavior patients. Now let's simply ask, what are the brain centers involved in aggression and violence? Aggression is not a product of our large cortex, either cortex. It's located in the so-called limbic system, here colored in blue, at different levels of our limbic system. There are distinct subcortical centers outside this big cortex involved in aggression and violence, and the most prominent is the so-called hypothalamus. Here we see that we just make a cross-section through this brain here, exactly at this point here, and we look from the one or the other side, and here we see the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part that is deeply phylogenetically controlled, genetically controlled, and it's the first part of our brain that develops. And it includes all autonomic functions, not autonomous, but autonomic functions, feeding behavior, and 3 kinds of behavior that are very important for aggression and violence. This is territoriality, aggression, and the link, the combination with sexuality. And if we now have a closer look to hypothalamus, we see first that it's very complex here. On the other hand, if we had a much closer look, we could see there are strong differences, anatomical difference between the sexes that can be detected by the naked eye. Because there is one part in this complexity, the medial preoptic nucleus, the nucleus preopticus medialis, which is very large in males. You can discover it with the naked eye. And this medial preoptic nucleus controls three important components of male behavior. This is territoriality, sexuality, and aggression. And this is coupled mostly by testosterone, which means one nucleus, one part of the hypothalamus, makes it sure that once people, the males, defend their territory, they are aggressive, they are dominant, and they are sexually active. This is of deep biological reasons. If you have to defend your harem, if you have to defend your territoriality, you have to be highly aggressive, highly defensive to defeat your competitor. And as soon as you were successful, you have to mate, because the competitor maybe come back. And soon you have to do what you have to do as a big, strong male. And he does it normally for 1 year, at maximum 2 years. So this catastrophic coupling in our culture between sexuality, aggression, and dominance is highly favorable in biological terms. And this is the fate that we don't need this anymore. The other interesting thing is that we do not know the neurobiological basis of female aggression. We know the biological basis of female sexuality. It's different from the male, but nobody knows very much about female aggression. It's a blank sheet, so to speak. So we can see this combination that dominates in all wars, in all human male behavior, territoriality, aggression, and sexuality is deeply rooted in the deepest part of our brain. We share it with all mammals, and maybe even with all vertebrates. Then there are other subcortical centers, and predominantly close to the hypothalamus, this is the amygdala. The amygdala, is a center for innate fear and for conditioned fear. So we learn what makes us to fear in an inborn way, but also we learn when and against which to have fear. For example, here, this is an innate fear. We go around in the Grand Canyon and we think there's a rattlesnake, and this is a beautiful illustration. We run away before we even recognize that it was a rattlesnake. And all our autonomic reactions go up. And the reason for this is that the amygdala, through the visual system and the thalamus, directly, unconsciously recognizes the threat and makes us run away before the conscious cortex recognizes what makes us run away. Maybe even a mistake, that it wasn't rattlesnake. So this is innate. But interestingly, the amygdala is the seat for the recognition of emotional facial expressions. For example, we partly do this by innate factors, but also we have to learn through the interaction with our mother what emotions are. We have an unstructured emotion as a baby, and through the interaction between mother and child, we learn, we refine the recognition of emotions, especially linked to the expression of faces. Very interesting, all criminals, violent criminals, have difficulties distinguishing this fearful face from an angry face. They can immediately recognize a happy face and distinguish it from a neutral, but they always have difficulties distinguishing between angry faces and fearful faces. And this is fatal because those impulsive, aggressive people say, oh, I thought he wanted to hit me, so I had, by prevention, had to hit him. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that he wanted to shake my hand, but it just seemed to me that he was aggressive. This is very typical deficit of the amygdala. Beside this hypothalamus and the amygdala, which are unconscious and subcortical centers, we have a number of cortical centers involved in aggression and violence. The most important is the so-called orbitofrontal cortex. This is the frontal cortex. Here are the eyes, and this the orbita. And above the orbita is the orbitofrontal cortex. This cortex developed latest during the development of the brain, 20 years. Only after 20 years we have a fully mature orbitofrontal cortex. What is the orbitofrontal cortex doing? It's the seat of social rules. We learn how to behave such that others are my friends or help me. And I learn that I have to remain or become friendly in order that this was an altruistic question, that they do something for me. I learn I have to do something for them so that they repeat it, they do something for me. They're the rules. That I suppress my egoistic impulses. This is very important. This is the seat of moral rules, of ethics, and we see this as soon as there are lesions, by tumor or by stroke or by incident, people can become violent overnight. I have seen it in my own family. Absolutely fatal. This is directly the seat of ethics and moral to tell me what I have to do in order to be unaggressive, to be patient. There are other parts which I will skip. Very importantly, there is another part of our cortex called insular cortex, very deeply inside here and overlooked for most of the time of anatomy. And this insular cortex is important first for my own pain. The pain, the limbic pain, the pain that really hurts is situated here, but also empathy. This is a very new insight that the pain I sense myself when I get my finger hurt is situated here. Here, this is the insular cortex, as I showed you in a cross-section. And here is a seat of the sensory deficit, of sensory being cut, for example. This is sensory. And this part of the brain has to decide whether or not this will hurt. Because many lesions also don't hurt. It's a question of attention, of learning. So the pain is situated here. If I now situated in a functional fMRI in this big machine where my brain can look through the closed skull, and I look that my beloved wife is being hurt outside the machine. I have empathy. I suffer with her. In the same way as I suffer when my finger is being cut, I suffer when they do the same with my wife or another beloved person. This is the root of empathy, the same part of the brain that is sensible for my pain, my own pain, is then used for social pain, for empathy. And you will not be surprised that psychopathic criminals lack this kind of empathy. They recognize the empathy, though they know, this person is treated very badly, but they do not suffer with him or her, as we will see in a moment. Now, what do we see regularly in violent, impulsive criminals? This is almost trivial now. The most consistent part is that we see some anatomical or physiological deficits in this orbitofrontal cortex. Almost all impulsive, reactive murderers or other criminals show this. And this is a strong indication when you test them. For example, here, this is seen from above, a brain of a murderer. And here in the orbitofrontal part of the brain, we have a big lesion for whatever reason. I just forgot. And this is absolutely regular. This does not mean that all patients or all people who have such a lesion are murderers. There are some who have such a lesion but did not, for one or the other reason, become a. I'll come back to this point in a second. But if you observe strong impulsive criminal reactions, you can be sure that either anatomically or physiologically you find something going wrong in this part of the frontal brain. Why is this so important? This part here, you see this again in longitudinal. Here is the orbital frontal cortex. And here are other parts. Here's the insula. I showed just a second before. These two. What they are doing is to control the amygdala, which normally is resided here, but I just drew it out to make it more plastic. The amygdala can be more active in a pathological way than normal in those violent criminals. For reasons I will explain in a second. So in those people, or in many of us, we have a hyperactive amygdala, which tells me the world is threatening me. The world is bad. I have to defend myself. I have to defeat the world. Now, our wise and intelligent frontal brains tells me this is not true. This is absolutely exaggerated. And it tries to keep the amygdala down. And this is possible for some degree. After we become 20 years, you will learn that the world is not so threatening as we thought when we were 15 or 16. So we calm down. In those people I'm talking about, this is impossible. So what we find in our studies in violent people is a weak orbitofrontal cortex and a strong hyperactive amygdala, among others. This is the most robust finding. So we can say the major group of violent criminals is characterized by two major things. They're hyperactive and impulse-driven. And their cortical centers are unable to dampen down this hyperactive subcortical drives. Why the amygdala is so hyperactive will come in a second. But this is the origin. They have a hyperactive amygdala, and this hyperactive amygdala cannot be damped down enough by cortical centers. These are 90%, and the second deficit is they do not adequately and sufficiently recognize the facial expressions and the gestures of the others. They misinterpret the behavior of others as absolutely typical. For example, in young Turkish males, when they are in a trial, they say to the judge, well, I assumed this other young boy wanted to attack me, and I had to defend myself. I'm sorry. I'm not aggressive. I just had to defend myself. Absolutely typical, 90% of cases. And this is typical in their brain, as I told you. Now there is a very small part of criminals, which is just the absolute top of criminal action. These are the psychopaths. There is a clinical Harris psychopathy checklist in the revised form. And there are two factors, aggressive narcissism, and factor 2, socially deviant lifestyle. This is for clinical reasons. But this is very interesting if you go through these psychopaths, because they are mostly not in prison. They are highly successful in society, even in the upper part of society. Because what they, in a clinical sense, this is not just invention, there's a clinical checklist, they have a superficial charm. They have a grandiose sense of self-worth. They are pathological liars. They are highly manipulative. They have a complete lack of remorse. They are shallow and a complete lack of empathy. If you look back to the economic crisis, this will remind you to some people you have read about in the newspaper. And also, lifestyle, proneness to boredom. They do this because they're always bored. They have parasitic lifestyle, which is just very telling. Poor behavior control, not always. Lack of realistic long-term goals. Their short-term goal is to become rich and powerful. Impulsivity, irresponsibility, and so on. So, and this is the most important, juvenile delinquency. They start very early at an age of 3 to 4. They're always a problem. What's happening with those people? If you test them, you usually use those nice pictures. You show normals and these patients those pictures. For example, this is assumed to be pleasant. This should be neutral, and this should be unpleasant. The question is that the effect of those pictures from the International Effective Picture System by my colleague Peter Lang is not very successful. This is effective in women. I'm sorry to say this, and does not work in males. It's pleasant. This does work in males, sometimes in women. But overall, it's difficult for brain scientists to walk in the brain feelings of pleasure. Very difficult. For one or the other reason, pleasure is not mostly situated in the brain. Neutral, I will not comment whether a cup of coffee is neutral or this reminds me to the weekend job I have sometimes to do, but let's see, it's neutral. And this is not highly violent. So we in our studies use video clips, which are really shocking. But even if we use these pictures, what are being measured is eyelid activity of persons. So they're starting to blink with their eyes, which is the best autonomic reaction you can have. Better than heart rate or blood pressure or so, it's just eye blink. And the common rule is if pictures are pleasant, we blink at a very low rate. Even very relaxed way. Here you see here, these are phobics, these are non-phobics, these are all of us, I hope. Non-psychopathic prisoners, these are impulsive, reactive, violent people, and these are the psychopaths. So pleasant, neutral, all the same. The only difference is in phobics, if we show them a big spider, a big spat fiber, then the eye blink goes up. This is good indication for phobias. Non-phobics, it goes up to some degree, this eye blink. If we are criminals, but non-psychopathic, violent criminal, it goes a little bit down, but not very significantly. Now comes, if we are psychopath, this autonomic reaction, which should go strongly down, up goes down. They are insensitive to threats that normally evoke fear in us. They're insensitive to fear. This is shown with this, strange. This is also shown when we measure the activity of the amygdala and we show these video clips, then the amygdala is silent in those psychopaths. Our amygdala, when we see ourselves going through a dark park and we are attacked from the side, our amygdala is just in a storm. Their amygdala is just silent. This is a very strong clinical indicator for psychopathy, among others. Now, there's another group, which is called acquired sociopathy, which is when you have a tumor or a lesion by a car accident or something else, then we see that a lesion of the orbital frontal cortex immediately leads to aggressive behavior. And there's a spectacular case where a person became more and more violent, and it was discovered in the brain that a big tumor, and the tumor was pressing on the orbital frontal cortex. When they removed the tumor, he was absolutely normal. Then, unfortunately, the tumor started growing again and become more and more aggressive. This indication, this is one part that dampens, that controls violent ourselves, and if this center, the orbital frontal cortex, is afflicted, then we become violent. And if this is at an adult stage, then there is some hope for therapy. If this starts at a very early stage, then this is more or less hopeless. So I said this. Now, what are the more molecular and the more cellular basis? What is behind this all stories? What we find, and my colleagues find, that all violent people have a deficit in one important neurobiological system, the serotonergic system. They have a low level of serotonin. Why is this important? Serotonin is a neuromodulator that calms us down, that tells our brain, be calm, nobody is threatening you. Everything is okay, relax. And as soon as this level drops down, people become, feel threatened. They become highly motorically active. And this is both in aggression, this is in anxiety, and this is in depression. All three diseases have one thing in common, that people feel anxious, they feel threatened, and this is a primary factor. And aggression is a secondary consequence of feeling anxious and feeling threatened. So the system that tells our brain, relax, nobody will threaten you, is not functioning. So people, prominently males, feel threatened and react in an impulsive way toward this seeming threatening world. Females instead mostly turn this feeling towards themselves, become depressed, or this leads to self-mutilation. Here we have the nucleus, the raphe nucleus, the dorsal raphe nucleus that spreads over the entire cortex, the serotonin, calming down all possible threatening impulses from the outside and saying everything is okay. Now there are two important things. There is a certain so-called polymorphism in this system. There are many different genes that in one or the other way in the so-called synapse control the release, the efficiency, effect of serotonin, and the uptake of the serotonin, so-called presynapse. There are 5 or 6 different genes that do the whole circle of production of serotonin, release of serotonin, maintenance of serotonin, and reuptake and resynthesis. And all those different critical points can be influenced by different genes. One most important, or very important, is the so-called transporter gene that makes the reuptake of serotonin back into the presynapse. And here, a lot of people have a long or a short variant of the so-called promoter region of their genes, controlling the expression of this 5-serotonin transporter gene. If you have the long variant, then everything is okay. Then your brain produces and metabolizes serotonin in a normal way. If you have a short variant, then for unknown reasons, it's really not strictly understood, this is not functioning, and finally you get a low serotonin level. This is not uncommon. It's because there are many different genes that control the serotonin level. Importantly, however, and if you have this gene polymorphism, you are not determined to become a criminal. It's just a genetic load. The more important thing is what happens early in your life. This is a famous article appearing in Science 2002 by Casby and Moffitt and many others, which heard, and they all heard about the discovery of this serotonin polymorphisms. And since they had a long-term study of about 1,000 children, about 25 years, and they had blood samples. They had the idea, let's look at the blood sample and at this, at a gene that controls the reuptake and resynthesis of serotonin. And what they found, to make a long story short, that on the one hand you have this low activity of the MOR, monoamine oxidase A activity, which leads eventually to a low serotonin level. This is the genetic load, which by itself does not lead to criminal behavior, but combined with no early childhood maltreatment or probable treatment and documented severe transmission in 4 different kinds of antisocial personality disorder or violent behavior. And you see this black column here. If there's a combination between low MOR activity and severe maltreatment, then these young people have a high tendency to become violent criminals. This has been repeated many times. There are some studies who are more careful, I have to admit, but most authors find that it's a combination of these 2 factors. A certain genetic load, which is maybe low, 20%, and a high factor coming from early negative childhood experience is at least 50%, if not more. Which means that person that had this genetic load but has a healthy and normal early childhood experience will not develop antisocial behavior. Whereas genetically normal person who has very severe maltreatment early in childhood has a much higher probability to become criminal, at least in males. In females will probably develop borderline or depression or anxiety. But both together is the extreme catastrophic case. This is the message behind. So, the factors determining and influencing aggressive violent behavior are general biological disposition to bodily aggression in male. This is situated in our hypothalamus. This is the phylogenetic heritage. And culture has to manipulate this heritage in a way, and this may be the decisive process if culture fails. If we live in a society that does not promote this control of innate behavior, but just promotes it, dictatorship or military societies, they start very early and they exploit this normal behavior, normal biological behavior. Second is genetic defects, prenatal development disturbances, perinatal and early postnatal experiences, and disturbances in the brain, for example, that this orbital frontal cortex or the insular cortex, important for empathy, does not sufficiently develop. The third and maybe most important factor is early negative experience. This is that complete lack of care by mothers, parents. This is sexual abuse, and this is body violence, very early in childhood. And this may be the most important factor leading to violent criminals. And then later are unfavorable social situation, poverty, ethnic group, unemployment, and so on. But this most probably, as statistics show, are secondary. The family situation is a primary situation, and poverty is secondarily linked to all these primary factors as far as we can see. And Professor Zirpka probably will talk about this tomorrow. And the dominant resulting biopsychological factor appears to be a deficit or lack in impulse control and of empathy. The major group has a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding the facial expressions of other people. Whereas the small group of psychopaths has a complete failure of caring for the fate of others, caring for the pain of others. Not that they don't recognize it as it was thought years ago. They recognize it very, very carefully, but they don't care or even enjoy it. And one other deficit of the psychopath is, very strikingly, they do not learn from negative consequences of their own actions. This is very striking if you have very young boys. It happened to me to be confronted with it, and they behave in an intolerable way when they are of an age of 3. Then they are punished. They are hit, they're taken off school, they're put into other schools, they are hit and tortured, and nothing will help, apparently. Why not? One major thing might be they do not learn, besides many other psychological processes, they do not learn from the negative consequences of their own deeds. Besides that they are expelled, they find their peers, their friends, and so they have a strong reward of being criminal. This is another part. But the major part seems to be they are unable to learn from negative consequences of their behavior. So, big question mark, what kind of therapy could we develop against those people? The first part, it's easy. Impulsive, reactive criminals can be treated and trained. This is not the problem. The problem are a minor group of psychopaths, as you all know. So, second conclusion, aggressive and violent behavior, biological, psychological, and psychological factors interact in a non-linear fashion. In most cases, neither genetic or developmental deficits nor psychological factors. This is attachment experience or early childhood maltreatment, or social factors such as experience of violence in family, school, and society alone determine aggressive violent behavior. Rather, the combination of genetic or neuroanatomical or physiological vulnerability on the one hand and traumatic experience in early childhood predisposes for criminal violence. And at the same time, these two major factors can compensate each other to a large degree, which means if you start with therapy or training very early, make bad childhood into good childhood. You can compensate for bad genetics, so to speak, and vice versa. So a normal child with good genes can tolerate a lot of negative experience, but not negative combination of both. Thank you very much.